For 7 years plus, I've been living in a traumatic situation.
Because if people understand the type of food, the kind of situation that we put in people in the prison, then they'll understand the need of why we need to take action.
We have to have a system, with the policies, procedures that ensures we visit the prisons, because it is fundamental. The fact that we've sentenced them doesn't mean we've ended our duty towards them. We have to go back into those systems, assess how they're living, whether their cases need review or issues have changed, and also just basically ensure that their basic human rights are being upheld.
Within the first 2 weeks of his being convicted and he's going into prison, he was denied food because someone wanted to have sex with him.
I witnessed people dying on a queue in a prison cell.
But unfortunately, before the release order could be issued, the young man died. So that, I think, is one of the cases that has stayed with me for quite a while.
That the death penalty does not inhibit capital crimes. That is established with absolute clarity from every bit of empirical evidence over the last 100 years. The system of mass incarceration has only existed for about the last 200 years. Before that, there was never mass incarceration in Africa. Before that, people were expelled from the village or they were sent away. They were given community-based punishments. Sometimes the death penalty was used. But the two things that we know are, firstly, that the death penalty does not inhibit capital crimes. That is established with absolute clarity from every bit of empirical evidence over the last 100 years. So if there were evidence that the death penalty saved lives, I would have a different approach. I'd say it's a terrible thing. But, you know, let us consider. But we know with absolute clarity based on empirical studies that the death penalty has no consequence.
Well, if you look at the judiciary, you look at it as a company. And as a company, its major profit is to see how many people have been convicted. And they are living up to that, because as I was checking the population in the prisons yesterday, it's actually at 15,000. So it's actually more than doubled. In terms of the overcrowding rates, yes, the average was about 260, but now we're going to about 270, 275, which is not helping matters.
I've had the opportunity to be part of the judiciary for the past 29 or so years. Started off as a magistrate, so went through all the ranks. There are some instances where from other areas there is incarceration for excessively long periods for people who have not yet been tried, who are on remand. And I thought probably sharing the best practice from the Zimbabwean side. We have an inspectorate team, a system in place for prison visits. Magistrates do it regularly. You can conduct an impromptu, unannounced visit, and you are free to check in every corner, every place to see, and also to interact with the inmates as regards their welfare and their well-being, even the prison officers. You can talk to the inmates freely with them, giving their issues.
To 2006, I was arrested and taken into prison on charges of murder. And I stayed there for a period of over 7 years and a half without trial.
So even for repeat offenders, yes, the law says that you should take them into prison. But they're repeating or they're reoffending for various other reasons, which I think we need to start interrogating at this point. Because someone repeatedly steals a bar of soap, or someone repeatedly steals a few cobs of maize because they're hungry. You call that person a repeat offender? So those are the questions I think we need to ask.
The second thing we know, this is more important even for us, is that long sentences do not deter crime. Now in South Africa, when the new democracy came in 1994, Parliament, the governing party, the new democratic elite wanted to be seen to be doing something. And what they did was to increase sentences, to make bail more difficult, to increase the jurisdiction of the lower courts, and radically to increase the number of offences for which the life sentences were possible. 1995, South Africa has 400 people serving sentences of life.
We had a decision in Malawi, which was rendered by the Constitutional Court, and which found that the conditions in prisons in Malawi were inhumane, and that their living conditions were a violation of their rights. So following that, we started making efforts as an inspectorate to ensure that the rights of the prisoners are respected.
The conversation about prisoners' rights has been revolutionary, but we have omitted one aspect, and that is children in prisons. Now, these are often not talked about because children by law are not supposed to be in prison, but that doesn't mean in practice they are not there. So in many instances, you find that because in many of our countries, death registration is not compulsory, or it's not done. So when a child is picked up by the police, it's very difficult for them to prove how old they are. And normally police prosecutors don't want to go through the process of taking a child through a child trial, and so they'll ask the child to say they are over 18 with promises that if you say you're over 18, you'll be out in 20 minutes. But the next thing, the child finds themselves being sentenced as an adult and being sent to adult prisons.
Now, we as judges don't deal in the metaphysics of evil, we deal with the practicalities of evil. But there are some people who are so violent that they have to be locked up for the rest of their natural lives. That does occur, it's rare. Having said all of that, having said why I believe in imprisonment, I think that we in Southern Africa do it wrongly, we do it excessively, and we, as I say to South African audiences, we are so busy trying not to drown that we're not learning to swim. And we can learn to swim by reordering our criminal justice system. Why do we have prison inspectorates? We are morally responsible for the population of prisons, so we must know about it.
When we talk about prisoners' rights, we also need to understand the context in which our prisons are in respect to issues of congestion. When we look at the jurisprudence that has developed around the continent, where different jurisdictions, judges have talked about how our prisons are bad and congested, and in particular I'll speak about Malawi, where we have a very progressive judgment where the court actually said that the conditions in the Malawi prisons amount to torture, cruel and inhuman treatment. And that judgment was a judgment of 2007. But now when you look back, you find that the prisons are as bad as when the court gave the judgment, and even worse than they were then. And the big question is, what are we doing to ensure that we decongest our prisons? If we understand prisons in the context that what happens in prison affects us all, because if we have congested prisons, we are creating a situation where various diseases, including TB, incubate in the prisons, and they are widespread in the prisons. And the people that are in the prisons, they eventually come out, they join us in the communities, and the diseases that they take in the prison, you find that they're also transmitting in our communities.
In life, I conclude to say prisons conditions, mainly in our country, is more or less to say the death trap. The death trap in what way? Life in prison is miserable. Due to congestion, life is not easy, and even the diet itself is not that nutritional enough that can keep the human being. The sanitary part of it also contributes early deaths in such a way that there is no environment which can accommodate somebody who is suffering chronically ill diseases.
There is also need to build more prisons to cater for people with their needs. We realize that those affected, for example, those with TB or contagious diseases, are housed in the same place with other inmates who are not suffering from the contagious diseases. There is need for facilities to be availed, rooms for proper isolation, and medical facilities to be provided. Efforts are being made, but more can be done to ensure that there is no violation of those inmates' rights.
And when I think about prisoner rights and how we as countries, especially in Southern Africa, are doing it, is the inability for us to work holistically. I think you cannot do prisoner rights without taking into consideration the amount of needs that they need because of the fact that they're incarcerated and they're not able to get to those things by themselves. And as such, although judiciaries are the ones who sentence them to those prisons, but the fact is states are the ones who are accountable and responsible for them whilst they're in those prisons. So the right to health, the right to education, the right to sanitary spaces, even the right to clothes, the right to food, are very fundamental for them. And in order for us to ensure that that is done, judiciaries themselves have to ensure that the laws and the standards and the policies are being implemented. We have to have a system, with the policies, procedures that ensures we visit the prisons, because it is fundamental. The fact that we've sentenced them doesn't mean we've ended our duty towards them. We have to go back into those systems, assess how they're living, whether their cases need review or issues have changed, and also just basically ensure that the basic human rights are being upheld.
I once found 3 boys in a prison in northern Malawi who had been there for over 9 months. These were students in Form 4, where they write their school leaving exams. They had missed their exams. They were in very congested and terrible conditions. And I had to constitute as a court right there and then to grant them bail and to order to give them unconditional release.
Sometimes you go into prison and you find undocumented prisoners who have overstayed there, and you're like, why are you here? Maybe on a homicide charge or on whatever charge, or they don't even know why they're in prison. And you check with the other agencies, They don't even have a file. They don't have anything. It's like this person was just dumped in prison. So in my time when I used to visit the prisons, I would release such prisoners. And sometimes we also had what we call camp courts, where I would go to prison and set up a court in prison. You'd have the state attorneys, you'd have the legal aid, you have the NGOs, several stakeholders would be there, and you deal with prisoner by prisoner, and then when, depending on what you find out from, you either release on bail or you discharge that prisoner. I mean, you have a prisoner who have stayed maybe over 5 years in prison, undocumented, and is appearing before you. Yes, the legal aid is saying we apply for bail, but in that case, to me, bail will not serve a purpose because this person is undocumented. There's no case record. So I just discharge these persons and say, I've discharged this case. When the prosecution is ready, they can come back and prosecute this person.
I personally affected with the time when I was in prison, and I believe this will affect the entire of my life in such a way that for 7 years plus, I've been living in a traumatic situation. And this sometimes, even as I'm out today, comes into my mind. Because the time when I was in prison, a lot of things happened. As I've already alluded to, I witnessed people dying on a queue in a prison cell. I witnessed people dying in a queue as we were trying to fight for food. I witnessed a number of situations which always come into my mind and left me with trauma. And to the nation, the situation in prison is not that good for a human being. And it is to my pleasure to the lawmaker and to the judges, even the magistrates, to take into consideration when imposing sentences. Even the state itself, when arresting, they should make thorough investigations, not just taking somebody behind bars on mere speculations or assumptions.
We visited a prison in Lilongwe where we found this young man. This young man had stolen a cell phone and was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment. Within the first 2 weeks of his being convicted and he's going into prison, he was denied food because someone wanted to have sex with him. So he was denied food for 2 weeks, after which he was forced to have sex, and then he was basically raped. So he then contracted AIDS. He was ignored because the treatment was left to his, or rather taking care of, his care was left to his fellow inmates, who also grew tired. And at that time, there were also all these apprehensions about HIV, so people were afraid to take care of him. When we went to that prison, I found him in a corner. He was naked. He didn't have any clothes. It was just a blanket covering him, and it was just a small blanket. He was all bones, and basically he was on his dying bed. We did make a recommendation immediately that he should be considered for release, but unfortunately before the release order could be issued, the young man died. So that, I think, is one of the cases that has stayed with me for quite a while. This is also besides now the conditions that the inmates in Malawi sleep in, because literally they have got only a space of 30 centimeters to sleep. So when they lie down, they don't have an opportunity to turn. In some prisons, the prisoners don't even have the space to sleep. So they either sleep whilst standing or they find a place to sit down. So that is also something that gets stuck with me.
There are a lot of stakeholders in the criminal justice system, and each one of us must play their role. Because you go to the prisons, I mean, the courts can do what they can, but there's still some stakeholder somewhere who needs to also play their part.
I think it's a misdirected question to ask us as judges, what are we doing?
Prisons should be thought of as spaces that we ourselves can find ourselves in. But the fact is, states are the ones who are accountable and responsible for them whilst they're in those prisons.
Remember that people go to prison as punishment, but not to be punished.